Okay, in this video I'm going to go through how to disable error recording and reporting in an EDC17 ECU file. It is important that you've already watched the EDC17 error delete videos and understand the process of finding the OBD or P error codes and the manufacturer error codes and the error path tables. I will go over that again, but this time it will be in brief, so it is really very important to have already seen this information on a previous video. Now, in the previous video we were trying to delete the code. So in other words, we were trying to find an error code, find the error path associated with that code and switch off the path. That means that once you've done that, that error code will no longer be flagged. But the error code and anything associated with the error code is still functioning in the background, so you haven't actually removed the error code as such. It's just not being flagged anymore. Now, in this video we are going to look at how it might be possible to shut down the error code and all the readings associated with that particular error code, so that it is as if that error code doesn't exist and the information or the error that leads to that error code is no longer provided, because all of the background information connected with that no longer exists. Now, this is possible in EDC17 ECUs because of something called error masking. The designers allow for errors to be switched on or switched off by a series of error masks. So if you mask an error, everything to do with that error will be masked, and therefore that error will not function. This is very handy for the designers, because the file designers can leave in place in the file lots of error reporting, but they don't have to use all of it, because in the error masks they can have some parts switched on and some parts not switched on, and then of course the parts that are not switched on are now irrelevant to that file because they will not be used and they will not show anywhere. Now, of course, sometimes it is handy to be able to get rid of an error completely because of some change that you have made to the car, and you do not wish that error to be in any way present or in any way to affect the car anymore. So that's what error masks are useful for. So what we're going to do in a moment is we're going to look for error masks. But as I said, we need to start with the errors themselves. So the first thing we're going to do is look for the errors themselves. And as I said, if you've watched the previous error delete videos, then this should be reasonably recognizable. I'm hoping this is the same ECU file that I used for error code delete. Now, what I'll do is I'll slowly work my way through and I will look for something recognizable. Ignore all the red lines, they're just notes that I've made to myself. Right, here we are. Here's a section. I'll just highlight it across there in grey. Now, that's probably going to be manufacturer error codes or VAG error codes. So there's one section of error codes, and then if I go along a little bit further, we get another section that looks very, very similar to the previous one. and that looks like it's running somewhere from, say, about here to here, and that is probably the OBD or P codes. I might have those the wrong way around, we'll see as we go through. But so that's a selection of those codes. Now, of course, it's fairly easy to find these codes because all we need to do is search for a code. We can pick a code at random, enter it, search for that number and see what we get. And so that's what I'll do, just to make sure that we know what we're talking about and we're in the right place for what we're talking about. So let's try searching for something that's relatively simple. We'll do hexadecimal. We'll assume that we're looking for P0400. Maybe that will give us something to look for. Will it let me move the cursor? Yeah, just move the cursor to the beginning. Right, we'll have a look. That doesn't look promising, so I'll ignore that. Oh, looks like I'm going to get lots of P400s, so that's not much good to me. I'll keep going. Oh, lots of them, so that's no good. So I'll jump a little bit further down. Try again. No, that's still not giving me anything that I'm interested in. Obviously 0400 is a very popular number. Oh, we're getting lots and lots and lots of... Oh, gone way past 0400. Right, now where has that put us? Is that giving us a number anywhere in this block? Because that looks like a code block. So let's have a quick look in there. Right, it says 01024, but we're still on decimal view, so we'll change that to hexadecimal view, and there we are. We've got an 0400 there, we've got an 0400 there, so it looks like we are indeed in one of the code blocks. Now I'll just confirm that because it looks like I've highlighted something here already, and yep, that's P0400 and I'm in the code block. I've made a note to myself over here that this is where the error code block ends. And it looks like I probably made a note. Yep, there we are. So there's the error code block starting for the P codes. So I'll just go back to normal decimal view because that's what I'm more used to looking at. So there we are, and then I'll go to the 2D view. So there we are then. So we've got there, that's our P code block. So that's a P code block. Now we need to know where the P code block starts and ends. The end is not quite so important, but the start is absolutely vital. So we need to check. Now these codes, when you go looking for them, they often start with a series of numbers, obviously, but the designers of the files very often put a blank in between, which is a non-existent code, and where you start counting from doesn't matter as long as you take that into the account, because that may or may not affect the positioning of everything else you do. So in other words, this might be the starting point, or this might be the starting point, because this is the starting point as in the first code, and this is the starting point as in what the designers had in mind when they started the whole thing. It doesn't matter from your point of view. All that it matters from your point of view is that you use the same spot every time. So if you start from the first code here, then you need to make sure you start from the first code when you look at the VAG codes. If you start counting from where you believe this blank code is, then of course when you get to the VAG codes you need to start at that blank point again. So you just need to be consistent. So where you start is not quite so important, but being consistent is. Right, let's go back and find the other code block and just make sure that's somewhere around about there. And there it is. And this one appears to start with 1, basically 0, 0, 0, 0, 1, and the first error code is probably that one there. So if I want to start with the first error code, then I want to start there. But if I want to start with what was probably the sort of the marker point, then I can start my count there. Now, I made this file a while ago when I was making some notes to myself, so it looks like I started with the blank point rather than the actual code. It doesn't matter as long as I make sure that I always count from the same place. Equally, it doesn't really matter if I get this wrong, because if I get it wrong, when I make a change in future, I might be one error code out either side, mightn't I? I mean, if I've counted from here and made a change when I should have actually counted from there, then I'll be one position out, my file won't work. But of course, all I need to do is go back, move one place in the file, redo the file, put it back in the car. So it won't take long to make sure that I've got the right spots and it's all lined up correctly. So being one or two spaces out doesn't really make much difference. So it's nice to get the addresses spot on first time, but absolutely vital, not really. Right, now what we are looking for then is the starting point, because we need a count. We need a count to tell us how many codes we've got and what position each code is in the table or the chart. So what I would normally do is I would arrange this so that it's 20 columns wide. I would put the start in the first column there on the left, and I simply count across, make sure that that is 20, and then I give myself some numbers just to make sure life is easier when I want to reference this chart. So in other words, I would go 20, 40, 60, 80, 100, and then when I get to there, all I do is I press Shift and Enter, and I type in the number because it's 100. I don't touch any of these because a box will be put around it automatically, so I just say OK, and I get a little red box. Then I do the same, 200, 300, so on, and then I keep going until I get to where I think the end is. Now in this case I got to there and I think that's the end, and I think that's code 882, which means the last hundreds, if you like, was 800. So I've numbered these up to 800, and then that's 20, 40, 60, 80, then I come all the way over here, 81, 82. Now the only reason I do that, as I say, is so that I can actually be fairly sure where a particular code is. In other words, if I want to know where is, it doesn't matter, we'll just pick a number. I mean, so where is that one? Where is that code? Well, in my list, it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. It's the 10th one. Doesn't matter what it is, but if I want that code to be deleted, I now know that if I go and find the error paths, which is something that you will see in the error delete video, but if I go and find the 10th error path and set that to 0, this code will no longer flag. So it doesn't matter what the code is, it will no longer flag because I will have deleted its error path. Now, we don't want to do that now. What we want to do is we want to mask the complete checking of that error. So I want this error to disappear completely. So all I need to do is remember that number 10 is the one that I want to go away. Doesn't matter what the error is, I'm just going to say to myself, whatever 50217 represents, that's the one I want to go away. Now usually, but not always, the place I need to look is right in front of this. So in other words, the next value before this value, that one there, is probably the end of the table that I'm looking for. So in other words, if I move this over to here, I keep going over and over and over, I get that to there, that one is going to be 882. I know it's going to be 882 because if it's the right table, then there must be 882 masks because I've got 882 errors. And if I go to my other error table, the P-code table here, I'm going to have 882 errors again. So I know 882 is the magic number. So starting here, if that's 882, then this, if I go across, that must be 880. 60, 40, 20. That must be 800, mustn't it? In which case that must be 700, 600, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. So that's 100, 80, 60, 40, 20. Go all the way across. That must be my start point. So my start point for 882 must be there. So what I would now do is I would mark all of those, but you can see I've already done that. What I would do is I would select this as a map, and I would simply, and you'll see I've already done it, there it is, it's a map. And if I look at the properties, I've written on there error masks start. So that just reminds me that's where I think the error masks start. And then over here I know that I've got 20, 40, 60, 80, 100. So again, all I've done is I've pressed shift and enter, typed in 100, OK, and that's now 100. And then when I get to the end, now that I'm fairly sure that that is the end, again, if I double click that, you can see that I've already made it into a map. If I double click it again, there it is, error masks end 882. So that's done. So now I can quickly find this easily, can't I? Because it's over here in my map list, so I can just easily find that. Now, I was talking about the one that was 10 across, wasn't I? I was talking about the 10th one. So in other words, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. So there is the mask that controls the 10th error that I've already looked at. And as we said before, don't care what that error is, because we're not interested in that at the moment. We're just interested in how would we go about masking off that error so it no longer works. And so how would we do that? Well, we found it. This is the mask that controls that error. So what we need to do is make this one go away. Now, there's a couple of ways, maybe 3 ways of doing this. It does tend to vary a little bit, so you'll need to bear with me on this one. The simplest and the first method to try for your particular file is to change that value to 0. So in other words, on this version of Windows, if I press equals, I get the box, and if I type in 0 and then click OK, do I really want to do that? Yes. OK, and now it's 0. Now all I need to do now is save that file, put it into the ECU, run the file in the car, and see if that error has disappeared. In other words, if all the reporting for that error has disappeared, then it's job done. Now occasionally that particular error, and it's not always easy to know this in advance, but occasionally that particular error won't respond to 0. So then what you would have to do is try an alternative, and an alternative that's worth trying is 65535. Anyone who does a lot of this work will be familiar with that sort of thing. So what you would do now is you would change it to 65535 and try that in the car, and see if the ECU accepts that and accepts that as being off. And if it accepts that as being off but didn't accept 0 as being off, well then you're good to go. And finally, if neither of those work, and that can happen, you need to try the midpoint. And if you know enough about the way these files work, you'll understand. And if you don't know enough about it, well, I'm not going to go into it now, so you'll just have to accept my word for it. But if you look around here, you'll see 32768 is used a lot, and 32768 could be being used as a way of getting some kind of maximum, but it could also be being used as a way of making that particular mask non-functional. Now I suspect that given that there's a fair number of zeros as well, it might well be that in this file 0 is the one that does it. But if you've tried 0 and you've tried 65535, then it's worth trying 32768 just in case. And then you'd put that in the car, try it and see what happens. Now usually you don't have to go through all of this. What usually happens is that you find that if you set the thing to 0, that's it, job done, if you've deleted the error. You can sometimes work out in advance, but it just takes a lot of messing around, because what you can do, and before I go any further, I just want to undo this. So I'm going to set that back to whatever the original value was. Because I don't want any changes in this file at the moment, so I'll just leave that as original. But you can sometimes get a clue as to whether you should be setting to 0 or 65535 or 32768. You can sometimes get an idea in advance, because sometimes you can look and say to yourself, hold on, what have I got here? I've got 19 and 20 are all set on 0, and then I've got 21 is set on 0, 22, 23, 24, 25 and 26 are set on 0. So what you do is then you go and look at the error code list and look at what error codes are under 19, 20, 21 and so on. So you go and look those up on your error code list, and then you need to know the vehicle, obviously, but if you're fairly sure those codes never show in that particular vehicle, then you're fairly sure that 0 is actually code off. This can be a little bit more difficult with some makes and models than others. With some cars, and especially some trucks, these sorts of things are really obvious, because sometimes you will see 0 and you will go and look at the error, and the error will be very clearly and obviously something that vehicle doesn't have. So let's say that you look, and when you look at the error, all the errors relate to a water in fuel sensor on a diesel engine, and you know that diesel engine hasn't got a water in fuel sensor. So now you know that 0 was being used to mask that particular error set, because that particular vehicle doesn't use it. But that's a lot of mucking around when you just don't need to do all of that, when you can just more or less do it by guesswork. So it's probably simpler when you're doing this to identify your error mask chart, decide which error you want to delete. Say I want to delete error, I don't know, I'll pick one at random, 66. So let's say I want to delete error 66, so I just go 20, 40, 60, come across to here, 61, 62, 63, 64, 65, 66. I would just set that one to 0 and then test the file in the car. I don't have to do any particular thinking about it. It's done, it's job done. Now, a clue to just knowing that you're actually in the right spot with all of this is, I'll just go to 2D view so that we know. There's the block that we're looking for. So the error mask block usually looks like this. So it's got occasional noughts and zeros, as we've said. So it's got occasional very low values. It's got occasional very high values. Bear in mind, I've said these possibly could be switched off ones. I suspect the 0 is the switch off in this. And then we've got lots and lots and lots of the midpoint, which is the 32768. Now, given how many 32768s there are, it's very unlikely that 32768 is the off, because if 32768 was the off value, almost none of the errors would work in this file. So I don't think there's much chance that 32768 will be the off value. I'm only pointing that out as a possibility because once or twice I have been caught out by errors where I was convinced that either 0 or 65535 would be the off, and it's turned out that the only way to turn that particular one off has been 32768, and it's one of those things I didn't know, so I didn't know until I tested it and found out. This block, sometimes it's difficult to find the start, so it's not a good idea to jump straight in looking at this block. It's usually better to look at the errors over here first. So look at your error code blocks, find your P code block, find your manufacturer code block, get those established, make sure they're both the same size so you know what you're looking for, and then come back and look for this masking block. Finally, don't muddle up this block with, and I'll work my way back, it should be back here somewhere, this block. This looks similar. Well, if you're half blind it looks similar, because if you notice, it's if you were to pretend this top part didn't exist, then from here up to there, across to there and down like that, that would look a very similar set of data to the error mask data we were just looking at. But it doesn't look similar because look at all these peaks that go way up high. Now these are the actual parameters for deleting an error. So in other words, this is where you can switch off an error by setting the time for the error to occur to 65535 and the healing time to 0. So basically the error will never occur, and even if it did, it would instantly switch off. Why don't we use this block? Well, there is a slight problem with trying to use this block, and you will work that out for yourself if you bother to have a close look at it. It's not easy when you look at this block to work out which parts of this block refer to which error. And that is because you often find odd bits and pieces in this block of data that interfere with the count of the errors. So if you count from beginning to end of this block, instead of getting 882 possible addresses, which will occur twice of course because there's an error and then an error heal, but even if you account for that data occurring twice, you will not get the exact double of 882. And if you think about it logically, why should you? Because if the people designing the file want to have an error, so the time for the error, and then heal, time for the heal, they don't really need to include every single possible one in here, because you could have error 1 and point to two values in this table, and you could have error 2 and point to two different tables. Let's cancel that. But of course there is no reason why you couldn't have error 45, let's say, pointing at two values there, and then error 46 pointing at the same two values, because if you wanted to use the same two values, you might as well point at the same two values. And so if someone has done that, you won't know, because there's no obvious way to see that. But what it will do is it will change the number of these addresses, because you now have at least one that you don't need to use because you've used one other one twice. So just beware of that. Don't start fiddling with this block unless you have managed to work out which parts of it are which. And of course, if you find an exact DAMOS file for your ECU file, that will probably tell you which parts of this, so in other words, which addresses are which errors, in which case you now know. But without the DAMOS, you will spend all your time by trial and error trying to work out which bits are which, and it's not worth the effort, because you might as well just not bother. You might as well not bother with any of this part, because this part down here will do the job for you. Now there is one proviso here. The person who designed the file may have allowed so that what happens is when you switch off one of these paths, everything associated with the error reporting, everything goes away with it. So in other words, if this had some undesired effect that you don't want, it's possible that undesired effect has now gone. But some undesired effects like D-rate, or limp mode as it's called, some of those effects are sometimes triggered by a separate route. So even though you've now done away with this, the actual undesired effect in the background of D-rate or limp mode may still run. Not always, but sometimes. So you need to be aware of that, because if you decide, oh, I can cure limp mode, all I need to do is get rid of this error checking, that may not be the case, because some errors will not allow that. And those errors are usually ones that force something like D-rate or limp mode, because the designers assumed that those errors were vital, so it would be ridiculous to have them masked out and then the error not show, because of course if the engine is going to be damaged by continual running, it would just be stupid to mask out the secondary effects of the error. So they don't mask them out, or at least if you try to mask them out, it doesn't stop that side effect. So you do need to take that into account. You can't just assume, oh, all I need to do is block the mask here and then that's it, no further problems. It's not as simple as that. But certainly for a lot of error checking, if you've got particular sets of error checking that you don't want done anymore, this is the best way to go about it. And of course, if you've done something like an EGR delete or a diesel particulate filter delete, then doing away with all the error checking that relates to those things is ideal, because now it doesn't matter whether you've switched the errors off or not, because the error checking isn't being used. So whether the errors are there or not there is immaterial, because they can't flag because they're not being checked. Lots of people who know all about this will often switch off the error mask so the error is not checked, and they will check the error and switch that off as well. You don't need to do both, but of course it makes you feel better sometimes to do both, because then you think to yourself, no way can this show up in any shape or form. Finally, one more thing to be aware of: if you live in USA, Canada, you have a thing called readiness, and changing things here will not usually affect readiness. So in other words, if you try to do away with a DPF or an EGR and then block all the error checking, all of that should work okay. You shouldn't have any problems. But you may well find that when the ECU does its self-check for readiness, the readiness still fails. So the error reporting system isn't picking up an error, but readiness is not complete. And to deal with that, you need yet another video, which I do intend to put out in the near future when I've got enough time to do it. Right, I'll stop there, because I think that's probably enough information for anybody to be able to use this error removal system or error masking system.